Hello and welcome to All You Need Notes for Edexcel IGCSE History, and this time looking at the Cold War topic Superpower Relations 1943 to 72. And to begin with, reasons for the Cold War. In this series of videos I'll be looking at everything on the specification for the Cold War part of Edexcel IGCSE History and looking at two effects of everything on there in order to help you answer the B question, but also if you remember this information it will help you answer the C question and even the A question too. So, beginning with long-term rivalry and the ideological differences. So one effect of this was that the relationships in the Grand Alliance became strained. So the US and the UK delayed opening the second front in the Second World War, so that was the front from the west attacking Germany. They delayed that until 1944. Stalin thought that they were allowing the Nazis to continue fighting the Soviets in order to weaken the Soviet Union, and so then obviously it'd be easier for the US and the UK to destroy the Soviets afterwards. So he was scared that they were trying to weaken him. But the US and the UK were also scared. They thought that Stalin wanted to spread communism across the entirety of Eastern Europe and to put an end to democracy in Western Europe. They'd seen the Russian Revolution of 1917. There had been immense torture, brutality, rich people had collapsed, their money been taken away, and the US and UK, which were capitalist countries, were very, very scared of this. So they did fear what Stalin's influence might do across Europe. A second effect was that Eastern European countries were vulnerable to communism. So Eastern European countries had been damaged by the Nazis invading, bombing, just shelling, and a weariness of war. So the citizens were poor, there was very bad sanitation, lots and lots of disease. They wanted change, they wanted recovery, they wanted a better life. Churchill and Roosevelt, so Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Roosevelt, the American President, they thought that Stalin would try and force communism upon these Eastern European countries. Stalin, on the other hand, he really feared the West and what the US and UK might do to him. He was scared that they might attack him, and so he wanted a buffer zone in order to protect himself against attack. So a bunch of countries by the Soviet Union in order to give him a bit of protection. The next thing then. So we look at three conferences as part of the specification. The first one is the Tehran conference in November 1943. So the Second World War's still ongoing and the Grand Alliance are discussing what might happen after. So the first effect of this was that Stalin was allowed a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. So the Soviets were allowed to keep the land that it had taken from Poland. So the Soviets were coming in from the east, going into Germany and advancing, and the US and UK allowed them to keep the land they had invaded from Poland in order to create a buffer zone against the West. So again, this idea of Stalin's very, very scared. He didn't want any possible attacks. He wanted a buffer zone and a sphere of influence so that he could install communist governments there. And so as a result, they allowed Poland to take some land from Germany so that Poland itself moved to the West. And this was a huge allowance from the US and the UK because the West obviously feared communism. They were capitalists, they didn't like the ideas that Stalin had, they didn't want his influence and his ideology to spread across Europe. So it was a big allowance, but Stalin had his troops on the ground, he had control of that area anyway, what could they do? And so what Stalin did though was to put in many puppet communist governments. So governments in these Eastern European countries who agreed with him, who would do what he told them to do, and so his influence spread. The second effect of the conference was that the US and the UK agreed to open up a second front in 1944. So we looked a bit at this. So Stalin was scared that the US and the UK were allowing the Nazis to weaken the Soviet Union because the Nazis were only attacking the Soviets really in terms of the armies fighting, and so if the Soviets were weakened by perpetual Nazi attack, they could be defeated very, very easily afterwards, and Stalin was scared that this was what the US and the UK were planning. And so Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to open a front on Germany from the west in France, and this would obviously end the war much, much quicker because Germany now had to fight on both sides, and so it led to their eventual defeat on the 7th of May 1945. Stalin agreed in turn because the US and UK agreed to open up the second front. He agreed that the Soviets would declare war on Japan after Germany was defeated. The US was at war with Japan, and this would just help America. The next conference is the Yalta Conference, which happened on February 1945. By this time, the war was still ongoing, but it looked very, very clear that Germany was going to be defeated within the next few months, and so they were preparing for what might happen after. So the first effect was that there was a declaration on liberated Europe. So Stalin agreed to hold democratic elections in the Eastern European countries that he had occupied. He was communist. Communism isn't democratic, and so this was a big concession for him. He was allowing these countries to decide how they wanted to be ruled. They could be ruled by communists. They could choose not to as well. And this obviously was a threat to his influence over these countries. But the US and UK allowed Stalin to maintain a sphere of influence over the countries that voted for a communist government. But in reality, Stalin only paid lip service to this idea. We'll see more of this in the next few slides. So, as an example, in Poland, there were two governments at this point. You have the Lublin Poles, who were communists. They were set up by Stalin, and they were his puppet government there. They followed what he said. But there were also the London Poles. So this was the pre-war government who had fled to London when Hitler invaded Poland. They came together and they governed together, but after a few months, the London Poles began to disappear. They were taken away, they were killed. Stalin was not allowing that coexistence between communists and non-communists. He was having his own way in these countries and not allowing these free and fair elections, and in other countries as well. He was influencing the elections, he was skewing the results, intimidating voters. So he did only pay lip service to the idea. It didn't really happen in reality. A second effect was that all sides agreed to split up Germany. So Germany after the war was split up into 4 zones of occupation. There was the British zone, the American zone, the French zone, and the Soviet zone. This was initially meant to be temporary. They wanted to discuss it a bit more after the war, see what permanent solutions they could find, but tensions began to increase and they never got round to it. And this eventually led, and we'll see this in the next few videos, it led to East Germany and West Germany being formed. The UN was also created at this time, and this meant that future war could be avoided, that they could talk about the future of Germany as well, and the future of Europe in a safe space. The final conference then is the Potsdam Conference, which happened in July and August of 1945. So by this time, the war's over and relations are starting to deteriorate between the two sides. So the first effect was that there was a compromise on reparations. So as we saw, Germany was split into 4 zones of occupation. They agreed on that. Berlin, which was originally in the Soviet zone, because it was such an important capital, it was so symbolic, they all wanted a share of that. So they agreed to split up Berlin as well. So Berlin also had 4 different zones. And the two sides differed on their opinion of what should happen to Germany. So the US and the UK didn't want Germany to be too weak. They wanted to punish Germany, but they didn't want her to be too weak so that she might be susceptible to communism, because obviously they didn't want communism to spread. But Stalin absolutely hated the enemy, and he wanted to crush Germany so that they could never rise again and declare war, and so wanted to take a lot of money from them. Reparations, obviously, is the money paid after the war, and so they came to a compromise on it. They couldn't agree on a set amount, and so they said that each side could take however much reparations they wanted from their own zone. So the Soviets took a lot compared to the US and the UK and France. A second effect was that there was disagreement over Eastern Europe. So Roosevelt has gone now, and instead we have President Truman. Truman is very, very anti-communist, as we'll see in the next few slides, and he wasn't as satisfied as Roosevelt was that Stalin would do what was right in East Europe. He really feared communism spreading. He didn't want Stalin's influence to grow, and Truman, well, he revealed that he had atomic bombs, nuclear weapons, to Stalin at the conference. And this led to further deterioration of relations between the sides. Stalin wanted a buffer zone now to really protect himself. He was a bit scared of what America was now capable of. And this led to a split in relations, and eventually what Churchill deemed the Iron Curtain across Europe. One side in the West was capitalist, and in the East it was communist, and there was a split in Europe. The next part then is the Soviet Union expanding into Eastern Europe. So the first effect of this was that it broke the Declaration on Liberated Europe. Stalin, as we saw, agreed at Yalta to allow Eastern European countries to have democratic elections, but, and I've just copied and pasted this didn't happen with the Lublin polls and the London polls. The London polls began to disappear, and Stalin was spreading his influence using malign tactics across Europe. And the US and the UK really feared Stalin spreading communism, his greater influence across Europe, perhaps trying to take on democracy itself, and perhaps spreading communism into West Europe as well. They were very, very scared of that, because communism could spread very, very, very quickly, and it would destroy the countries that they lived in. Second effect was that tensions began to increase. So Truman, he was very, very fearful of Stalin. He was very fearful of communism, and there were disagreements between the two. They were much more opposed than Stalin and Roosevelt had been. Truman didn't give Stalin any benefit of the doubt, and as we saw, Truman revealed that he had atomic bombs at Potsdam, and relations just worsened. And this was the root cause of the disagreements at Potsdam. They hadn't agreed on the reparations in Germany. They'd fallen out about Eastern Europe. Truman really did not trust Stalin at all. Final one then, are the attitudes of Truman and Stalin. And this is just, rather than a two effects thing, a little look at it for perhaps question C or question A. So in 1946, Truman received what was called the Long Telegram. It said that communism fed off weak countries like parasites on diseased flesh, i.e. communism would spread very, very quickly, and it said that Stalin wanted to spread his communism across the globe, and was very, very anti-capitalist. And Truman himself was very anti-communist. He feared Stalin's growing influence. He didn't like the potential of communism to spread into America. And so he tried to make himself seem more powerful. He wanted to make Stalin fear him. And so we mentioned the fact that he had atomic bombs. And in August, so not long after the Potsdam conference, he did bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. On the other side, Stalin received the Novikov telegram in the same year. And this said sort of the opposite thing, that the US wanted to spread democracy, wanted to spread capitalism across the world. And obviously these ideas go against communism. And so Stalin feared what Truman might be doing. So the two sides were completely opposed. And this obviously led to increased tensions and really the Cold War itself. And there's a nice picture of the leaders sitting together at Potsdam. So, thank you for watching this first video in the All You Need notes for Edexcel IGCSE History on the superpower relations 1943 to 72 topic, or the Cold War as it's easier to call it, and on this first section, reasons for the Cold War. I hope you enjoyed. I'm going to be continuing with this series of videos on the Cold War, so please like and subscribe if you enjoy them. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.